Right. Good morning, everybody. My name is Henry Hale. I'm professor of political science and international affairs here at the Elliott School and also director of the Petrov program on Ukraine here at our Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies at the Elliott School. And it is my great pleasure to chair this really interesting event, which is dedicated to a forthcoming book which is called Living the Independence Dream, Ukraine and Ukrainians in the Contemporary Socio-Political Context. We have an hour to pack in a lot of discussions, so I will keep my own remarks pretty much to that. And I would like to turn things over directly to the editor of the volume, Dr. Lada Kolomiets. She is currently Harris Visiting Distinguished Professor at Dartmouth College and also Professor of Translation Studies at the Taras Shevchenko National University in Kiev. Among other things, she's a distinguished poet translator and member of the National Writers Union of Ukraine, and her current research focuses on issues related to post-communist transformation, Ukraine's digital folklore, and popular mobilization. So let me turn things over to you, Dr. Kolomiets.
Thank you very much. Let me tell you a couple of words with the origin of the idea of the book presented today, which originates from the panel Living the Independence Dream, Ukraine and Ukrainians in Contemporary Socio-Political Context, the author of which was Antonina Borizovenko, and the session took place on November 14th, 2020 at ACES virtual conference. This panel was chaired by Miroslava Znayenko, Professor Emeritus at Rutgers University, and the presenters at this panel were Antonina Borizovenko from Igor Sikorsky Kiev Polytechnic Institute with a paper Making the Future or Remaking the Past, Historical Narrative and State Building Process in Today's Ukraine, Tamara Vorobii, Towson University and Johns Hopkins University with a paper Happiness, Misery and the Economy, and Olga Humilko, National Pedagogical Drahomanov University with a paper From Unhappiness to Life Challenges of Ukrainian Identity. I represented Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev and served as a discussant at this panel. Shortly after the convention, we received an offer from Vernon Press to publish a collective monograph under the same name as our session was called, which was a sign of topicality of the theme. And by February 2022, we were supposed to submit the full text of the monograph to peer reviewers, but Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine destroyed our plans. Unfortunately, objective reasons abruptly interrupted our work, as I said, and significantly delayed it. But as of today, the book is ready to be sent to the publisher's peer reviewers, and therefore we decided to hold its pre-publication presentation in order to talk about our project to a wide audience using the capabilities of the George Washington University online platform and to hear feedback about our work from the academic community. Contributions selected for publication made up the unique and highly important content of the book project, which started before the beginning, as I said, of the full-scale phase of Russia's war against Ukraine. Today, the title of the book sounds even more important, burning, and insightful. I take the opportunity today to express my sincere gratitude to all contributors to this project and thank them all for their participation in it. And now let me briefly switch to my presentation and run through it. Cyber war, Ukraine's digital folklore and popular mobilization. It is important to talk about Ukrainians, how they perceive the Kremlin's neo-imperial policy since the beginning of full-scale war against Ukraine on digital platforms. In this defensive war, Ukrainians seem to have overcome their ages-old victim complex of Russian colonialism and are attacking the enemy with flowers of their national and natural sparkling humor, ridiculing the Kremlin's imperial newspeak with its aggressive actions and intentions by means of parodistic translation, anecdotes, walking sayings, and other varieties of humor genres, which spread in social media networks, uniting Ukrainians and forming a single national narrative aimed at resistance and defeat of the aggressor. Ukrainians act on media platforms as the diaries and chroniclers of their experience, and events of the war unleashed by the Kremlin are truly depicted there, which made their inborn humor especially striking, bitingly sharp, and also life-affirming, full of positive energy and invincible laughter. The primary objectives of my research are to analyze, as I said, humor as Ukraine's latest weapon in the Russian war against Ukraine, then the specifics and forms of folklore genres of Ukrainian people's digital war with Russian propaganda discourses, and the ability of the people to influence an ongoing conflict in real time via virtual conversation. For instance, in this slide, you see how a traditional proverb about Ukrainians is surrounded by new meanings. If we say today Ukrainians are invincible, this is the added part to the traditional Ukrainian proverb about Ukrainians. Then when it's bad, they cry. When it's very bad, they sing. And when it's very, very bad, they laugh. But they never give up. This is another new addition to this proverb, traditional proverb. And this saying became so popular instantly. The same day it appeared in public space, and it was quoted, posted, retweeted by many users and electronic media. If you just say invincible or unbreakable, the only word would instantaneously lead you to the whole traditional proverb, to this not only traditional but topical today important saying about Ukrainians. For instance, one of the users asked quite rhetorically, why shouldn't one fight against Ukrainians? And the reason is just one word, invincible. And the word is reminiscent of the whole saying. The same story about Stepan Bandera. Once Stepan Bandera is actualized, he was before the Second World War. He was the leader of the right-wing nationalist movement. And the Russian secret service police was so scared of his name that even nowadays the conscious Ukrainians are called Banderovцы, so the followers of Bandera in contemporary Russia. And Ukrainians fight with Russians not only by their courage, but also trying to scare off the enemy by the name of Stepan Bandera, and such anecdotal stories, exchanges like, do you know how Kako 200 would be in Russian? Banderolka. In Russian, Banderolka. The basic name is the name of Ukrainian national fighter, Bandera. So everybody knows what Kako 200 means. This is about that. Yes. A lot of poetry appears, which is attributed to Ukrainian leaders of public thought, popular poets. The most authoritative among the leading poets is Lina Kostenko, unwavering poet and patriot of Ukraine. And her poetry is published, but not only her poetry. This is one of the latest poems written on March 19th, 2015. Horror, blood, death, and despair, the screeching of a vulture's sword. A little gray man has brought a black scourge. This is a beast of a dreadful breed, the Loch Ness monster of the cold Milan. Which way are you looking? Peoples. Today is our turn, tomorrow is yours in English translation. But at the same time, a lot of poetic mystifications appear in public space, poems attributed to Lina Kostenko. And the name of Lina Kostenko helps Ukrainians to fight. The same story about Taras Shevchenko, the greatest poet of the Ukrainian nation. A lot of poems are attributed nowadays to Shevchenko, and there is also the Fox Check platform, which deflects this, attribution of the newly written poems, topical poems, attribution of them to Shevchenko. And John Russia's was created by Ukrainians, and it is nowadays supported, developed actually by authoritative historians Timothy Snyder and others. And Russianism is considered as a combination of fascism and or Nazism and Russian nationalism. And what is very interesting, periodistic translation as the construction of Russia's newspeak, a lot of funny interpretations of the basic concepts of the so-called Russian mir, of the Russian world, are interpreted periodistically. For instance, Крым нашист, один народ, one for the nation, but if one for the mouth, when it makes no sense. When one translates not the meanings of the words, like один народ, one nation, but the sound, the form, how the word, how the expression sounds, we will have the nonsensical translation. And Ukrainian journalists and simple people on media platforms train on those newly created meanings by translating the sound form of the original expressions, like узкий мир, very interesting interpretation of русский мир as a narrow world, a precedent about a Russian president, пересидіти, пересидеть, to stay too long in the office. Yes, and interesting words are created. Like sometimes we have bavovna in our news as a substitute for a Russian хлопок. In the Russian language, homograph of name is pronounced with the first syllable stressed, хлопок. And if we translate with the first syllable stressed, хлопок, into Ukrainian, we will have bavovna. And very often, even this slogan, let's make bavovna great again, based on the American slogan. You know which one. So the Ukrainian journalists and ordinary people use expressions like powerful cotton could be heard. It makes no sense in direct translation, but everybody knows in Ukraine that what it is. The news anchors have at the backstage a branch of bavovna behind their backs. And neologization, new words, neologisms. For instance, macronity, to call often and to no avail, took long and fondlessly on the phone. Валяти Scholza, from the name of the Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, to be constantly promising but not giving anything, etc. And Ivanka Johnson, the current president of America, is called Ivanka Johnson, because in Ukrainian equivalent for Joe will be Ivan, and hypochoristic form Ivanko, and Johnson, the son of Johnson. This is allusion to the British Boris Johnson, who was the first to strongly endorse Ukraine in the Russian war against it. I will finish here. Thank you so much for your attention.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Kolomiyets. That was fascinating. We will next turn to Judge Lochdan Mute, who is senior judge of the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Among other things, he has been actively involved with democratization and rule of law initiatives organized by the Judicial Conference of the U.S., Department of State, and USAID in Ukraine. Among other things, in 2015, he was appointed a member of the Constitutional Commission of Ukraine and has received many honors, including Ukraine's Presidential Award in 1995. He's also a visiting professor at the National University of Kiev Mohyla Academy and the Ukrainian Free University in Munich. So let me turn things over to Judge Fute.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction. So I don't have to say anything about it, but I will be speaking a little bit about perhaps a different topic or a different way. I was asked to talk about my book, and this is my story, To Reach the Unreachable Star. And it's available, so just listen. My life as a federal judge on the United States Court of Federal Claims commences in May of 1987. It has been a very rewarding and satisfying experience for over 36 years. I'm still on recall. And not only in adjudicating citizens' claims against the federal government and dispensing justice, but also having the opportunity to participate in rule of law programs in Europe, Latin America, and especially in Ukraine, the country where I was born. My dream became a reality. And this is the story of someone living the American dream. It is the story similar to Miguel Cervantes's Don Quixote, to reach the unreachable star, to dream the impossible dreams. I had the honor to be a member of the working group of Ukraine's constitution starting in 1992, which was adopted on June 28, 1996, and received the recognition of international organizations, including the Venice Commission. By the way, I'm very proud of being working with Constitution, and also on the day it was approved, June 28, 1996. June 28 is my birthday. So I see it as a gratitude for the input of my work. Also, a very interesting aspect in the discussion in the working group was the idea of separation of powers, a separate judiciary, as well as private ownership of property. And the Constitution of the United States was adopted in 1987. However, the Constitution of Orlik was adopted or was agreed upon in 1710. And already that Constitution had the provisions for a separate judiciary, separation of powers, as well as private ownership of property. So speaking at some of the judicial conference in the United States, Sandra Day O'Connor, a former justice of the Supreme Court, was always trying to mention the fact that Ukraine already had separation of powers almost 80 years before the Constitution of the United States. That's one aspect of my work. The other aspect of my work has been as an international observer of elections in Ukraine and also in European countries. And starting in about 1991, and I was a member or working with IFES, the International Foundation of Election Systems. And going through the years, I must say that the last election taking place in 2019 with the election of President Zelensky, all international observers agreed and were very, very complimentary of the election that took place as a democratic, open, and without any complaints, the election of President Zelensky in 2019. By the way, I mentioned IFES. For your information and knowledge, there was a student from Kiev-Mohila University also working part-time for IFES. Today, that student is the ambassador of Ukraine in the United States of America. And that's Oksana, the Honorable Oksana Markarova. So that is for your information. And finally, also my work as a teacher and professor, visiting professor at Kiev-Mohila University. And my view are establishing the rule of law in Ukraine. Naturally, we're talking about sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, democracy, and adherence to international law. And that has been expressed in the 3 editions. By the way, one of the topics of my lectures and in the book, there are several articles, is on Holodomor genocide. And this year, as you know, Ukraine commemorates and the world commemorates the 90th anniversary of the tragic event where over 10 million people were starved to death by the Stalin regime. So let's remember that. Now, comment concerning Ukraine's present endurance against Russian aggression. Unfortunately, since 2014, after the successful revolution of dignity that forced President Yanukovych to flee the country, had some negative implications for Ukraine, which started the process that is presently before us. Russian soldiers, so-called green soldiers, moved to occupy and control Crimea, and the Russian politicians worked on its annexation to the Russian Federation, designing and conducting a referendum, a fake referendum. The Crimea referendum to join Russia on March 16, 2014, violates Ukraine's constitution, domestic laws, the Constitution of the Republic of Crimea, the general principles of international law. Countless international organizations in most countries around the world have already stated that under no circumstances is the Crimean referendum legitimate. Therefore, the results will not be accepted and recognized by international community. Most notably, it bears reminding that under the 1994 Budapest Agreement, a memorandum on security assurances of the United States by the United States, Great Britain, and Russia have all undertaken a commitment to provide guarantees against threats or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine's accession to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Ukraine, in exchange for Ukraine's accession to the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and giving up the world's 3rd largest nuclear arsenal. Ukraine has complied with its end of the agreement, but the other signatories failed to adhere to their obligations. And by the way, recently, a few days ago, even former President Clinton said it was a mistake and he regrets of having having suggested for Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons. After the annexation of Crimea, Russian soldiers helped the separatists to invade and controlled areas in Donbas and Luhansk. The process lasted several years. In February 2022, the Russian Federation recognized these illegal occupied territories as separate republics, again in violation of international law. Then on February 24th, 2022, the army of the Russian Federation, under the orders of President Putin, commenced its invasion, war actions, and aggression against Ukraine. By order of President Putin, they moved with the intent to eliminate, destroy, and exterminate Ukraine and Ukrainians. Genocide. The name Ukraine must disappear, calling it denazification, a denial of the existence of Ukrainians as a group, its history and identity. Acts include performance of mass killings, bombardment of residential areas, deliberate attacks on shelter areas, on evacuation routes, on humanitarian corridors and healthcare, rape and forced transfer of Ukrainians to Russia, including thousands of children. And that's why the International Court of Justice has issued a warrant of arrest against Putin. Hopefully, he will be tried soon. Bucha and Mariupol are classic examples of such atrocities. Ukraine filed a complaint against Russia requesting interpretation of the Genocide Convention that was filed on February 27th of 2022 with the International Court of Justice at The Hague, an institution of the United Nations. That complaint was partially granted on March 16, 2022. The ruling clearly and unequivocally ordered Russia to immediately suspend the military operations in Ukraine that Russia commenced on February 24th of that year. The retribution claims are still pending. The decision was rendered by the chief judge. The International Court of Justice issued a significant ruling in Ukraine's case against the Russian Federation under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The decision is similar and in line with the International Court of Justice decision in the case of Bosnia and Herzegovina against Serbia and Montenegro in 2007. It is the state's responsibility to prevent genocide under Article 1 of the Convention. Here the state, Russia, the Russian Federation, is promoting genocide, a clear violation of the Genocide Convention. Russia is in breach of the Genocide Convention. The court decision was issued but not observed by Russia. Also, it was not implemented by the United Nations. My final comments concern the case filed by Ukraine with the International Criminal Court at The Hague. Ukraine filed a case alleging war crimes, crimes against humanity, aggression, and genocide being committed by Russian forces. On February 28th of last year, the Prosecutor General Karim Khan said, "Today I wish to announce that I have decided to probe with opening an investigation into the situation of Ukraine." He sent an investigation to Ukraine, and I saw him on TV visiting Bucha and commenting on the investigation. He formed a committee of investigators from Poland, Lithuania, and Ukraine. Similar complaints have been filed with the International Criminal Court by 43 countries. Now we are waiting for a decision. Hopefully, it will be issued promptly. In addition, a special tribunal in Ukraine started trials of Russian soldiers for war crimes. The evidence is overwhelming, and actually the warrant of arrest for Putin has been issued. Now, foreign leaders and scholars are calling these acts genocide. Genocide against Ukrainians must be stopped. The United Nations Court, the International Court of Justice, issued an order to stop the war, but Russia is not obeying, and the UN is not implementing its own decision. The present international system is at risk. The stakes are very high. Security and freedom, security and freedom depend on justice in Ukraine. The same can be said about Europe and the free world. It is a dilemma for all of us. Do we need a new world order? That's the topic for a different conference. Thank you for your attention.
Our next speaker is Dr. Antonina Berezvenko, who we're delighted to say is a Petrock Fellow here at our institute. She is Associate Professor at the Department of Ukrainian Language, Literature, and Culture at National Technical University of Ukraine, Igor Sikorsky Kiev Polytechnic Institute. She's taught at a number of American universities, including Columbia, where she led a monthly roundtable on language policy and the language situation in Ukraine. She's widely published and has broad research interests, which include issues related to national identity, propaganda, linguo-semiotic analysis, and language policy in post-totalitarian societies. So, Antonina.
Thank you very much, Henry, for introducing me. My chapter in the book we discussed today is called Making the Future, Remaking the Past, Historical Narrative and State Building Process in Today's Ukraine. The emergence of independent Ukraine in 1991 changed the vision of its future both in Ukraine itself and in the world around it. The change in the vision of the past after the declaration of independency gave a new impetus to intensive changes in the linguistic and semiotic space of Ukraine, in particular in the area of creating national historical grand narrative. As one of Ukrainian historians sadly noticed, after independency, it was as if we had no history. In fact, it exists, but it is not at all similar to the one we studied earlier. Therefore, on the threshold of the independent future dreamed of for generations, a powerful request to understand who we are and what is our real history was formulated in the public consciousness of Ukrainians. The liberation of Ukrainian society from the pressure of the Soviet totalitarian ideology made it acutely aware of the need to fill the spiritual and intellectual vacuum that was created after the disintegration of the USSR and the discrediting of the communist utopia as an actual project of the future. As the Ukrainian historical narrative became saturated with information about previously hashed up or distorted facts, not only the vision of the past, but also the principles of the evaluation changed, which necessarily affected the perspective of the future. The more Ukraine accumulated new knowledge about itself, the more it stimulated qualitative changes in national self-awareness. Within this new self-perception, its own system of categories and classifications was drawn up, according to which the existence of independent Ukraine as a sovereign European state unit appeared as a logical and ultimately humanitarianly valuable phenomenon, although it did not coincide with the discursively encoded established Russian-Soviet imperial worldview and grand narrative of the same threat. Increasingly, in the historical narrative inside the country and outside of its borders, Ukraine appeared as a subject that has, in Bourdieu's word, the power of separation, distinction, decision, recognition, which removes previously hidden units from the invisible continuum. I think that it will be not an exaggeration to say that the Maidans, without which the modern Ukraine today cannot be even imagined, are the result of the unfolding of the own historical narrative on which the national / civic / political identity is based, which the society is ready to defend. Because having one's own, albeit uneven history is obviously a more attractive prospect for any people than not having it at all. From today's point of view, it can be concluded that the process of creating the historical narrative of independent Ukraine was not linear. Already in 2000s, the process of self-criticism of Ukrainian historians joined the restorative processes. The pendulum of narrative evaluations and judgments has swung the other way. Dissonant with the pathos of the first decade of independency, there was criticism of excessive ethnocentrism, fascination with the past, its idealization, heroization, etc. At the same time, I have to underline it, the historical narrative of the former metropolis itself was imbued with vigilance to the process of writing of the national histories in the post-Soviet space already at the end of the 1990s. Today's experience of the large-scale conventional war of Russia against Ukraine proves that the widespread exaggerated delicacy, restraint, if not shyness, of the definitions of the Ukrainian historical narrative regarding clearly harmful, if not hostile and threatening phenomena, proves that the development of Ukrainian statehood has long been necessary a national historical grand narrative, which has not yet emerged, by the way, which would represent the national past in a consistent way in the paradigms of modern historical thought on the one hand, and on the other hand would serve as a safeguard against the creation of a Russian neo-imperial mythologized narrative. After all, it was the fragments of the latter one, its separate micro-narratives that turned into various caliber propaganda weapons in the information war of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. Today we can say that during the 30 years of independence, the Ukrainian historical narrative has undergone a significant evolutionary path towards the formation of its subject's image. It's unfolding as a narrative of a sovereign state, despite all the unevenness of the process of state building itself and the narrative regarding it. Even if the society is not offered an unequivocally status approach to this or that problem, affects the establishment of its independence modus operandi. Today, it is obvious that the accumulation of a critical mass of not only central research, but also the growth of genre diversity, the publication of previously closed archival materials, epistolaries, biographies, the encyclopedic editions, historiographic reference resources, inclusion in the wide circulation of translated works related to history of Ukraine. All this gives the fabric of the modern Ukrainian historical narrative depth, full-bloodedness, and multidimensionality. And therefore, self-sufficiency as a factor of state and nation building. Step by step, it supplants the emasculated and distorted Soviet narrative, which gradually ceases to be a factor in the formation of modern Ukrainian state and national identity.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Kristenko. Fascinating material, and we will now turn to our next speaker, who I believe is online, right? Dr. Socio-Political. And she is leading researcher of the Skovoroda Institute of Philosophy at the National Academy of Sciences in Ukraine, and teaches at Kiev Mohyla National University and the Ukrainian State Drohomanov University. So her research interests are in social and political philosophy, philosophy of education, philosophical anthropology, and environmental philosophy, among other things. And so she works in her research on the philosophical implications. So look forward to hearing what she has to say. So, Dr. Milton, the floor is yours.
And thank you very much for inviting me and to take part in this project and to deliver some, my reflection on the current event, but because it's very connected to the subject of my chapter in the book. The title was Happiness as Value, or Why Are Ukrainians Unhappy? And the article was written before the Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 2022. At the same time, the war changed the Ukrainian people dramatically. The war didn't make them happy, but at least brave and optimistic. And of course, we now cannot talk about unhappiness of Ukrainian people. In my opinion, the chapter's topics has become more even relevant, thanks to the study of the transformation of the value priorities in Ukrainians. It is possible to understand the dynamics of their national building in the context of decolonization and decommunization process. The decolonization of Ukrainian society is a restoration of its authentic national identity values. The imperial and Soviet stereotypes of Ukrainian identity create a false image of Ukrainians, distorted it, and replacing the essence of national ideas with specific external attributes as the Cossacks, Vareniki, Sala, Sharavari, etc. Overcoming those stereotypes reveals the coherence of the ideas and values of Ukrainian culture with the European tradition. And the value of individual freedom is one of these. My chapter reveals the post-colonial challenge of Ukrainian identity in the pre-war time. One of the post-colonial syndromes was the lack of psychological happiness and comfort. In the World Happiness Report 2019, they reached their historical minimum and became the happiest country in Europe. The Ukrainians had no valid reasons for such sentiments. The report stated that this life assessment by Ukrainians was significantly underestimated and did not correspond to its quality. Despite all the evident achievements of the post-Maidan period, which had expanded the zone of individual freedom, Ukrainian world perception remained dim, negative, and pessimistic. Anti-Western political rhetoric exploited that mood. They often spoke of impoverishment, genocide, and experience conducted on the people, creating the atmosphere of despair and disappointment. The 2019 Ukrainian presidential and parliamentary elections were affected by those sentiments. A new political agenda had been established. Most Ukrainians choose a dream over reality. The national identity was at risk. The Russian invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2020, indicates that making Ukrainians an unhappy nation was a deliberate neo-colonial policy to kill its freedom-loving spirit. Nevertheless, despite all those efforts, they failed. Ukrainian people are optimistic with a strong faith in victory and happy life in the future. According to a public opinion poll at the beginning of the war, 93% of Ukrainians believed in a victory over Russia. At the same time, half of correspondents hoped that Ukrainians would be able to win the war with Russia in a few weeks. A quarter believed that the war would last several months. At the same time, only 12% thought that the war will end in 6 months or more. According to this poll, almost no people did not believe in victory, did not believe in a failure at all. But the war has been going on for more than a year. Has the war broken Ukrainians? Do they feel unhappy? The answer is obviously no. Sociological studies show that optimism of Ukrainians has not decreased. The results of sociological research of Razumkov Center testified to changes in the priorities of values of Ukrainians. It's about both individual and ecological and civic value orientations. According to these studies, more than 64% of respondents believe that democracy is the most desirable type of government for Ukraine. This is the highest indicator over the years of observation. The figure regarding the attitude of Ukrainians to their citizenship is also impressive. More than 90% of Ukrainians are proud of it, and more than 24% are very proud of it. This is also the highest indicator for the entire period of sociological monitoring. These indicators are important because until recently, Ukrainians considered themselves as an unhappy nation and accordingly didn't value their citizenship. And belief in victory until unites Ukrainian society and exceeds 90% of respondents. The most unexpected was that almost 50% of people believe in the better future for the country, and 36 feel like patriots. Despite the war, Ukrainians mostly think positively about the future of Ukraine, and therefore hope has become the most common sense of Ukrainian thoughts about the future of their country. Almost 30% of response think so, and 40% of Ukrainians feel optimistic. These figures are certainly in stark contrast to the data of Ukrainians in the World Happiness Report for 2019. The sociological data confirm the high level of vitality of Ukrainians. More than 50% of Ukrainians didn't feel weak and do not perceive the surrounding world as hostile and dangerous. There is a lot of information that Ukrainians are becoming more organized, disciplined, and calm. Paradoxically, the war forced them to become more optimistic and happier. In this way, the war stimulates post-colonial and post-Soviet value changes, which are necessary conditions for the modernization of Ukrainian nation. Democracy, the rule of law, and human rights constitute the value orientation of such changes. Thank you.
Thank you for that terrific presentation. So we now turn to our final speaker of the morning, and that will be Dr. Bohachevsky-Pomyak, who is actually former GW professor, so we welcome you back. She's a historian, civic activist, and researcher at College. She was senior program officer at the National Endowment for the Humanities and also has been director of the Fulbright program in Ukraine. And her most recent book is Ukrainian Bishop American Church, which appeared in Ukrainian translation in 2020 in Lviv. So happy to turn things over to you.
Thank you very much. The last book I wanted to title The Conflict Between Church and State in the Absence of Both, but the publisher wouldn't let me use that title. I was asked to explain what Ukraine means to me. And as I started thinking back what Ukraine ever meant to me, my whole life seemed to be structured. I want to assure you that I did not lead a structured life. I did not plan it. It just happened as it happened. For me, Ukraine was always equivalent of its people and of the physical blob on the map that said that Ukraine exists. And it always existed as a separate concrete object. Now, the question was, are Ukrainian people Soviet? Have they, in the decades of Soviet regime, developed into a type of ideologues, as we presumed the Germans had developed during the Nazi period? Or are they really individuals, free thinking, as Czeslaw Milosz suggested the Poles were? So the question before me as a teenager growing up in the United States, but having been born in Western Ukraine at that time, occupied by Poland, the question was, why have the Ukrainians failed in their various dramatic and bloody attempts to establish a state? Especially, why could they not have established an independent state, which they established, established 1917, 1922, but have not been able to keep it? So, as a historian, I was faced by two choices. Either the Ukrainians were so money grabbing that all of the leaders succumbed to bribery, or perhaps the Ukrainians were ignorant of their own history, ignorant of themselves. I remember one of the first popular articles I did for the National Endowment for the Humanities newspaper magazine. I started about Ukraine in 1988. An article on my experiences visiting Ukraine earlier and then was that how do you deal with people that do not know their own history? Or worse yet, know the false history. Growing up as a war child in Europe, I learned very quickly that politics are fluid, that reality does not reflect reality, nor does it reflect the truth. Now that I'm half blind, and because I'm an old university professor, I tend to drone on. So to prevent my droning on, I made myself some cheat sheets, but I can't seem to read my cheat sheets. And the cheat sheet finally says that I experienced politics as a child. And having experienced politics as a child, I looked at the world maybe more globally than other, certainly, kids in the United States. I set up to study Russia because the existence of Russia as a major state, as a geographical mass, is a given for Ukraine. So I wanted to see to what extent Ukrainians are subject to the heavy Russian boot. I must say, and in the article in this book, I go into some detail, that what was extremely important for me as a graduate student was to go to a program that, believe it or not, Gloria Steinem, not yet a feminist, organized, that made it possible for quite a few of us to participate in Soviet-sponsored youth academic festivals. That gave me a chance to meet Ukrainians who were exactly of my age and pretty much of the same mindset. This is the early 1960s, and from that time on, I had personal specific proof that despite everything, Ukraine exists, but it is the country of Ukrainians in Ukraine. When I came back from these visits, I sought to explain my understanding of the Soviet Union and of the need for cultural exchanges with the Soviet Union, of the need to use all possible areas, all possible venues that were available to my not only colleagues, but in my youthful naivete, also to the Ukrainian emigre community. That got me into hot water with the Ukrainian emigre community, which accused me of communism and God knows what ever since, although my life was really not all that exciting and not all that important. I tried with others to do everything we could to understand the dissolution, gradual dissolution of Russia, which seemed, of the Soviet Union, which seemed inevitable, and the moderate step-by-step approach to take to the development of, to the emergence or re-emergence of Ukraine. What I do in the article is go through some of the steps through what we were trying to do in the 60s, especially in the 70s with the human rights movement, and in the 80s, an attempt to keep up a lifeline to Ukraine where the renewed Russification started. So when the book comes out, I hope you find it interesting, and I'll be more than happy to answer questions. Thank you.
All right, well, we are pretty much out of time, but maybe what I would suggest is we take, because I don't see any questions on the chat. We just take one question if there is one from the audience, and then we'll wrap up, and then we can just kind of let the conversation emerge informally afterwards. So if there is any one question that anyone would like to address first, yes, please, just identify yourself. Katya Ruban, I could say, yes. Visiting fellow here, yes, since we don't have time. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Katya. I'm a fellow here. I have a question to Antonina. I just want to make sure I understood everything correctly. So you say that Ukraine still lacks this kind of like grand historical narrative, right?
Yeah.
Can you please specify like what do you mean? Do you mean that there is no like Ukrainian textbooks with like the proper, in your opinion, grand historical narrative? So there are no like just good books on the history of Ukraine, or do you mean like more like public perception of history?
Well, it's a part of the problem, but the main thing is that not everything, not all topics are covered yet that would be coherent to each other. This is the thing about the grand narrative, you know, because if you take the narrative of Toynbee, you know, it will cover like the whole history of his own country, and it will show the connections with the other histories in the world. This is something that is forming now in Ukraine, for example, and you can probably find the book of Hrytsak, Yaroslav Hrytsak, right? And he is trying to fill out that, like those lacuna with his work. There are other works like Miroslav Popovich about the Red Century, where we can find like the connected view of the different problems. And this is the thing that is about the grand narrative. Let's say like Russia as an empire does have it, you know, because all those accents that's supposed to be put there, and Ukraine still doesn't have it because there was no good circumstances for this war, you know, because when you can create the grand narrative, it's only within the cradle of the state. When you have a strong state, then you can allow yourself to build up your own view on every single problem that relates to your country, to your history. This is the thing. And about books, it's also true, you know, because it's endless discussion about the school books, the lack of them, the quality of them. This is also part of that.
Okay. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank our speakers. I should first say I very much look forward to the book, so be sure to let us know when it comes out, and we'll be happy to spread the word and encourage people to the extent that our speakers can hang out a little longer here we can engage in informal conversation. And thank you so much for giving us this opportunity to hear from you today. Thank you.